Watson Boone Duncan III was born on February 16, 1915, in Charleston, South Carolina, the son of Watson B. Duncan II and Herveline Spear. His grandfather, Watson B. Duncan, was an itinerant Methodist minister, as well as a scholar and author. He published 2 books on poets in the early 1900s, and as a lover of literature, was an early influence on his grandson. The family traveled widely in their religious ministry, and it's believed that Duncan took his first steps in Homestead, Florida. As a young boy, Duncan was known as Booney, and he would ride alongside his grandfather in a horse and buggy on the country back roads en route to the rural churches, listening to the old man as he recited the words of the poets and the stories of their lives. These early trips, filled with the telling of tales from the masters, had an electrifying effect on young Booney. Duncan's father was also a Methodist minister. It was the family's hope that young Booney would follow in the tradition and become the 3rd Methodist minister in the Duncan line. But as he could see firsthand, the life of a minister was difficult and one that held no real interest for him. By early adolescence, Duncan was attending school at the Epworth Children's Home in Columbia, South Carolina. It was a church-oriented boarding school, and Duncan spent long periods away from his family. At Epworth, he earned his keep in the school print shop. As with many future men of letters, the print shop was an early exposure to the written word. It was in his early teens that Duncan determined his life's course. He would not become a minister as his father and grandfather. Rather, he decided to be a teacher of literature. It was sometime during these early years as a teacher that Duncan developed a love for one of Chaucer's most notable lines: "Gladly would he learn, and gladly teach." This line would follow Duncan through life and, ultimately, into death. In 1948, Duncan left South Carolina for South Florida. Founded in 1933, Palm Beach Junior College was the first public junior college in the state of Florida. By the end of World War II, PBJC classes were being held in the military barracks at Morrison Field, now the location of Palm Beach International Airport. Duncan's early classes became so popular, finding space became a dilemma.
In his classes, we had a serious problem all the time we were with him, is to find a place big enough to put him.
In class, we sort of cut up, and Mr. Duncan, we called him the 3rd because of his name, Watson B. Duncan III. The 3rd just let me know after class one day in a very loving, kind way that if I didn't straighten out, I would find myself out on the athletic field with slightly less than a D in his class. Consequently, we had a nice conversation, and I decided to settle down. We began to love him because we understood what he was doing, and I finally made the highest grade that I ever made in that class, a C. The very first day I became president, I said to him, "Mr. Duncan, do you remember when you threatened to throw me out of your class because I was cutting up a little?" And he said, "Eddie, I knew you would remember that, and I knew you would do something about it." And at that time, I kneeled down on one knee in order to show respect to the 3rd. And as I kneeled down, just as quick as a light, he placed his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Oh, rise, O sea student of yesteryear." During class registration in his 2nd year of teaching at the college, Duncan looked up from his desk and saw a striking 18-year-old woman signing up for one of his classes. He would later tell friends he saw an inspired vision, and in his own poetic way was reminded of John Donne's The Bait. "Come live with me and be my love, and we will some new pleasure prove, of golden sands and crystal brooks, with silken lines and silver hooks." But she was not to be a fleeting specter in one of his classes, but rather she would become his wife and best friend. I'd like you to meet Honey Duncan. Hi.
I'm Honey.
You remember the first time you saw him?
Oh, like it was yesterday. I was registering for class, and it had only been a year since the college had moved from Palm Beach High. So I knew a lot of the teachers because they had doubled as the college teachers and high school teachers.
Oh.
And he was a different face. I didn't recognize him. But I do remember seeing him that morning.
So What was your first date? Or
Well, I was in his freshman English class, and there were 3 girls in the class, about 40 boys. And so the girls all had a good time in the class. But I asked him to the Sadie Hawkins dance that the college had every year. And he said, no, I don't think it would be very wise for us to do that. So we double dated. I dated a boy that lived in the dorm, and he was the dorm advisor. He lived there, too. And so as a courtesy, he would ask me to dance, and it just evolved from there.
now settled into work that he loved and happily married, Duncan began creating a 40-year legacy of teaching excellence. This worn old lectern became one of his trademarks.
When we were first married and the college was in Lake Park, it was very small then, and he taught 5 different subjects. He had 5 preparations, and in addition to that, he had the Beachcomber. He was the sponsor of that, and the men's social club, the Fight or Die, and in those years he formed Firo Pi, but he was directing the plays, so he was out of the house almost every night. I worked, and I'd get home, we'd have dinner, and he was off to play rehearsal. And this went on for about 4 or 5 years like this. He thrived on it. He loved to be busy, always stay busy. He just made learning such a pleasure. Everyone looked forward to going to class. But then as the years went by, and I would hear from parents of students, and it seemed like so many of the kids wanted to go right home from school and repeat the lecture word for word to their parents and tell them all about it. And I just thought, well, that's something that's very special, that most teachers, you don't go home and quote them. And then, you know, he was always a great teacher to me.
For most of Duncan's students, it was their first in-depth exposure to the writers he taught. And for many, it was the beginning of a lifelong love affair with their words.
And Grendel stands there and licks his chops because he has vision of a 15-course meal. Many a warrior sealed in slumber and a host of kinsmen, his heart rejoiced. The savage monster was minded to sever lives from bodies ere break of day, to feast his fill of the flesh of man. Notice the alliteration there. To feast his fill of the flesh of man.
Duncan's enthusiasm for literature was infectious. He didn't simply read the tales, he lived them.
The Anglo-Saxons were gluttons. They would have orgies in their mead halls. They would bring in whole cows, whole sheep, whole pigs, and reach out and grab a leg of mutton, grab a leg of pig, and cow. And of course there would be bits and pieces everywhere and grease all over them.
He considered all the works his favorites, and many lectures were accompanied by chalkboard illustrations. Duncan took us on exquisite journeys. With him, we visited John Milton's version of heaven and hell in Paradise Lost. We picked daffodils and wandered in the clouds with Wordsworth. We swam the Hellespont with Byron, admired the beauty of a Grecian urn with Keats, watched Ariel soar on a romantic couplet with Alexander Pope, followed Samuel Johnson and James Boswell on their nightly visits to the taverns of 18th century London, and explored the secrets of Malahide Castle. We learned not only the words and their meanings, we learned the lives of their authors. Students hung on Duncan's every word, hastily scribbling notes on every bit of information, every favorite line, every choice bit of scandal and gossip. We learned to share his love of the literature, but maybe even more than the subject matter. We came to love the time we shared with him. With Duncan, every class became an adventure.
I try very hard
to make the material come alive, to step out of those ponderous covers of that English literature textbook and the writers and the writings to come alive for the students. The main thing is the personal contact. To keep the interest of the students, you've got to hold the interest of the students to get your material across. And you simply cannot bore a class. That is the cardinal sin of instruction, is to bore a class. An instructor has no right to bore a class. And I try to make